Hello, and welcome to the Vibrant Systems YouTube channel. Let's just take a moment to enjoy this beautiful day that we have today. I'm coming to you from southern Alberta on Treaty 7 territory, which is the traditional homes of the Blackfoot Confederacy and Métis Region 3. And the reason that I want to start this video by talking about that is because this video is going to address topics that are a little tougher, such as privilege, accountability, and emotional labor. Because as we're moving into building communities, this is the next episode in the building blocks of community building. As we move into building communities, we are asked to do a lot more emotional labor because as we build authentic and reciprocal relationships with other people, we need to learn how to coexist with them and co-create something strong. And as a white person, I know a lot of other white people struggle with this because most of us were raised in a very individualistic society, where if we can take care of ourselves and maybe our families, maybe our extended families, we're doing pretty great. But to extend beyond that, at least in my experience, it's never really been a part of it. That's not something I was taught how to do, but it's always been something I've really cared about. And I've been spending a lot more time with friends and family right now having these conversations. And so I know there's this desire to have more community, to have more friendship. And there's still this fear of, oh, well, if I say the wrong thing, I'm going to be rejected. And this largely comes from being in that place of privilege. And yes, privilege and marginalization are both intersectional depending on our, cumulative identities. We're going to experience privilege in some ways and marginalization in others depending on who we are. Some people don't have any marginalized identities in their makeup as an individual, and oftentimes it is those folks, we'll say it, usually the cis, white, straight men in our society, who really struggle with this aspect of understanding their privilege, but also being able to take accountability for the ways they need to show up and deconstruct that privilege, and being willing to do the emotional labor. And I've tried to record this video a few times now because it is really important for me that I say this properly. And I know that where I'm standing, I'm pretty much that same level of privilege. So I understand there are so many fears and structures and barriers that I do not have to encounter based on how I was born. And I'm thankful for that in some ways, but of course I want to be mindful of that because community building transformational communities is a really big part of my calling, my purpose, what I want to do with my company, Vibrant Systems. So for those who are new to this conversation, even though it's been going around for quite a while, privilege doesn't mean there's a lot of bugs out. I love the ecosystems, but the bugs can be a lot. Privilege doesn't mean we haven't had hardship in our life. It doesn't mean we haven't had to work hard. It doesn't mean we haven't faced struggles. It doesn't mean we haven't failed. It doesn't mean, that we haven't had instances where we're scared or even attacked in some way. That's not what privilege means. But it does mean that based on our identity, there are certain hurdles and barriers and structures that we don't even know exist because they are not enforced on us. So this between a man and a woman, for example, a man might have no fear walking down the street after dark. As a woman, I have had many times where I've been walking down the street after dark and I'm on high alert because I know that because of my gender that I am, that I am more vulnerable to potentially being attacked. Now, women of color, and especially Indigenous women, this vulnerability is much, much higher. The rates that my Indigenous sisters, and that's the collective, but that Indigenous women and queer Indigenous peoples are victimized are much higher than for myself. And I've had a few instances where my own privilege has kind of slapped me in the face a bit. I remember once I was at a dinner party with a friend of mine who I had met through karaoke, and she was Black and her friends were Black, and there were women and men there. And the women were having a debate with the men about whether or not these Black men should be cooking, if that was important to have equality or not. And so eventually they turned to me. And my response was very much exactly what these Black women had been saying the entire time. But the Black man at that dinner party, changed his mind as soon as I was the one who said it. And that was entirely because of my skin color. Another example for me where I realized, oh, yes, I am very privileged, is I was privileged to be able to go on this field school in the first place. But when I was in university, in my bachelor's degree, I went on a month-long field school to Sri Lanka. And it was an amazing experience. I really adored the culture, the foods, the music, everything that I got to see. And there was one night where I was out with the other students, and we were watching a performance on one of the streets. And so we were out later than expected because we wanted to experience the full experience of watching these traditional dancers that happened to be doing a performance on the street. And then, as we were walking home, many of us young women, we were not scared. It was after dark because it does get dark around 6 p.m. there. It was after dark. It wasn't super late though, and it just didn't click into any of us that, oh, maybe this is something we should be worried about. We got back to the hostel where we were staying, and our professor is Sri Lankan. She looks at us and she's like, the only reason you guys could do that is because you're Canadian. And most of us were white. And again, those are just two instances where I was suddenly faced with the privilege that I didn't even know I had. And often this is the case. But the other side of this privilege conversation is that as more and more activists and creators are speaking about the struggles that they're facing in their lives, many people in positions of privilege are hearing that they are privileged and becoming defensive. They're not listening to the struggles that these marginalized communities are talking about. They're not listening to that. What they're doing instead is telling them, oh, that doesn't exist because I can't possibly be privileged because I've been through XYZ difficulty in my life. And there's a lot, understandably, it just makes sense for the name, there's a lot of privilege in that perspective, right? And the more privilege that we have, the more that defensiveness comes up. Because our worldview, the worldview that we were born into in so many ways, feels like it's being attacked. It's not being attacked, but it feels that way. And when we feel attacked, our natural biological instinct is to defend ourselves. Now, the unfortunate thing here is there's not much excuse for this in today's day and age. These are conversations that have been going on for, I would say they're in the mainstream for a minimum of 10 years. Minimum. Probably much longer. And they've been happening for decades and even centuries in some cases beyond that. So this is not new information, but still, and it almost feels like there's more and more of this, still there are so many people who are resistant to accepting the fact that they come from a place of privilege and their work is to listen to those in marginalized communities and to create communities where those structures have been changed or transformed. Again, unfortunately, that does not seem to be the regular response, which makes me sad because that is something I do try and show up to do. And I do understand that defensiveness that rises up when we're held accountable for something we said or some unintentional harm that we've caused or might cause by going through with a certain action. And that's kind of the next thing I want to talk about, is because coming from a place of privilege, it's not my fault for being born white. It's not my fault for existing in a society where in so many ways I don't have to worry about certain challenges. But I need to take accountability for how I reproduce those systems in the way I speak, in the way I make relationships, in the judgments that I hold of other people, and especially for my business, how I move forward building community. Because diversity is one of my values, because I believe that we have so much evidence that diverse, respectful communities are much stronger than the echo chambers we get when we find people who are exactly the same as us. And so I need to be able to show up, even in this video, and take accountability for the times that I misspoke, for the ways I maybe caused unintentional harm. And that accountability, for many people, is very uncomfortable. And the more privileged we are, so especially white people, the more privileged we are, the harder it is for us to take that accountability. And in some ways, if we do experience marginalization in another aspect of our identity, such as the fact that I'm also neurodivergent, I'm also queer, there is that tendency to be like, oh, well, because I'm also these things, I don't have to take accountability for that aspect of my privilege, which is not true. Whoever we are, wherever we're coming from in our lived experience, we are responsible for our actions, for what we say, for how we affect other people. And that means taking accountability is understanding that, okay, I didn't mean to cause harm, but I'm going to listen about why what I did or said or tried to do caused harm. And because I want to be a good person, I want to build communities based on respect and diversity, I need to do the learning necessary to understand why that harm was there and how I can move forward differently. And this accountability is something that even when so many people in positions of privilege, even when they're willing to accept that they caused harm, they aren't willing to take accountability for the learning that is necessary so they don't do it again. And this easily looks like, oh, well, if someone just explained to me what I did was wrong, why what I did was wrong, then I'll change. But again, in today's world, with all the creators we have, all the books we have, all the websites we have, there is no excuse not to do that research yourself. You just have to be willing to actually listen to the people who are already taking the time to explain it, and lift up those voices who are doing that emotional labor already, and do the emotional labor yourself to come into these conversations not from a place of defensiveness, but from a place of learning. And I think that part, to me, is something I've really been reflecting on. Because if we're in a conversation with somebody, and maybe we use a word, and they're like, oh, you shouldn't say that word anymore, it's offensive, and you ask that person to sit with you and walk you through why that word's offensive, even though most of the time those words are well known as to why they are offensive. If you're doing that to someone who is a part of that marginalized community, you are asking them to hold your hand and do the emotional labor aspect of learning with you. And if you're already still showing up and using that word, they don't even know if you're going to be willing to change or absorb the information you're sharing, because that's something that in many ways we should be past already. So if you're in these community spaces and if you feel people pulling away from you, it does feel like rejection. But sometimes that rejection is because you have shown and continue to show that because you're unwilling to learn, you're not a safe person to build community with. And when marginalized communities are already doing so much emotional labor to build new systems, to communicate these things on a grander scale, to educate and to really survive these structures that were not made for them to thrive in. That is such a position of privilege, to ask for that level of energy to be given to you when really, in a lot of cases, you are set up to succeed already. And I know it's not that simple. I know we all have hardship in our lives. But your inability to accept the fact that there are people around you who have more hardship based on who they were born as, through no fault of their own, your inability to accept that is why people are pulling away from you in community. That is a big part of why so many people in positions of privilege do feel isolated right now, because they need to be willing to do that work, to unlearn these patterns, to unlearn these worldviews. Not saying they need to throw away their own values and that they have to suddenly change how they live their life, but they need to open themselves up to accepting that other people in these marginalized communities have an equally valid set of values, worldview, and experiences. And ideally, a big part of this shift in building these new communities and transforming the way we exist in the world means you also start to do that emotional labor for yourself and with other people of privilege. And that's why I'm sitting here recording this video. And for the record, if I have said something that you would like to speak to, I invite you to share in the comments, kindly, hopefully, because I am also coming from a place of privilege and I have so much learning to do. And I'm open to that because I want to build these transformative communities. So the real question, though, if you have resonated with this idea of feeling rejected and rejected and rejected in these community spaces, what can you do? What is your work? A big part of that work is finding groundedness in yourself and being able to regulate your emotions and separate yourself from your thoughts that are often knee-jerk reactions so that you can open yourself up in a regulated, good faith way to these new conversations, especially if you haven't been exposed to them before. And this means doing the very basic work of knowing what words you shouldn't say. Maybe doing the work, too, to really understand why and stop making excuses so you can use them. Because at the end of the day, showing up with kindness and compassion and empathy doesn't mean you have to be right. And when you continue to use a certain word or continue to push a certain agenda that you know is harmful for other people because, oh, well, white people used to be slaves too at one point, hundreds of thousands of years ago, as if that's equivalent, then you're not doing the work. And asking marginalized communities to do that emotional labor for you is disrespectful, truly. This is one of the reasons why I'm creating my video course, Elements of Self, is to help people find this rootedness, this groundedness in themselves and in their authenticity so that they are able to enter communities in a way where they know how to self-regulate, where they know how to manage their emotions and confront their limiting beliefs and be open to growing in new ways. Because we aren't really taught that. And for many of us who are in these positions of uncomfortability or rejection, our gut instinct is to then go and find a community that's not going to challenge us. And this is how a lot of white people or a lot of men end up in these echo chambers about what maybe these marginalized communities need to change about themselves so that we're not uncomfortable anymore. But the problem, well, there's many problems with those echo chambers. A big problem with that is growth is normal, expansion is normal, diversity is normal. And when you're in these echo chambers, you're sealing yourself off from all of that. And it does not support your authenticity or your well-being. And so it's really critical that we do the hard work, the important work of being able to show up in a community in a safe way. And if you're someone who does come with a privileged identity, understanding that you may have more emotional work to do, emotional labor to do, to be able to show up in a safe way where you can unlearn what you didn't even know you had to unlearn, and you can help build something new. And again, as a white person, so many of us are not taught how to do that, and yet it is the most important work any of us can do in today's day and age. So if you're interested in my Elements of Self video course, you can go to my website, vibrantsystems.ca. Under services, there's the video course link, and you can get on the wait list for that right away. Otherwise, subscribe, like, and subscribe, and let's make your story a vibrant one.